Welcome everybody. Apologies for the slight delay. Apparently something else is going on in the financial world at the moment, which Sir Vince was being asked about, but we can maybe ask about that later. I've got a different question I wanted to ask first, but before that, thank you to everyone for coming along, and particular thanks obviously to Sir Vince Cable for joining us. You'll all know that Sir Vince Cable was Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills from 2010 to 2015, and then was leader of the Liberal Democratic Party. Go back to the beginning, he studied economics at Cambridge, but we won't hold that against him. I mean, the Cambridge bit. Before going on to be public advisor, government advisor, various roles, chief economist at Shell, etc. Before going on to be an MP for 20 years, including being a government minister. There's many reasons why we'd have wanted to invite Sir Vince to Kellogg, and I should say that this is just a taster for the real event this time next year, when Sir Vince will genuinely be able to be at Kellogg with all of us, and you'll all be able to get a chance to talk with him over a glass of champagne on the lawn afterwards, and over formal dinner afterwards. But one of the reasons we're particularly keen to invite Sir Vince is because of his commitment and passion for lifelong learning, adult education. And having briefly introduced Sir Vince to you, then Sir Vince, I should maybe introduce Kellogg College to you, which is equally committed to lifelong learning. Until Kellogg College was founded in 1990, you actually weren't allowed to do paid work as an Oxford student during term time. In other words, you couldn't study part-time until Kellogg was formed. Sometimes people tell me, well, that can't technically be possible because you can't have a business school without an executive MBA where the executives are allowed to continue with their careers. So I have to say, oh dear God, you don't think Oxford would have permitted a business school in 1990, despite Harvard Business School having been successful for 100 years before then. So it was only when Kellogg was formed in 1990 that people were able to study part-time for degrees at postgraduate level. And we hate to say we told you so, but that's so successful that we've now got more students than any other college in Oxford, with the most international college. And it's for that reason that we sponsored the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, which you kindly promoted at our press launch, and the conclusions of which were very similar to the independent commission that you launched and shared on lifelong learning around the same time. We both launched simultaneously, not realizing the other was launching at the same time. So I'd like to start by asking you about that, about lifelong learning, adult education. You know, why is it that you think it is so important? What particularly did you find out forming and running your commission, and why, you know, what more you think we can do to try to get the message across?
Yes, well, I'll maybe start right at the beginning, actually, which is why I do have a passion and commitment about it. And I suppose it came from my parents. I mean, a lot of people of my generation, my parents left school at 15, worked in factories, and my dad did night school and eventually qualified to teach building trades in an FE college. And my mother was a factory worker. After the birth of my brother, had a breakdown, what we call postnatal depression now, but recovered with enormous amount of help from adult education and learning history and philosophy and things that she never had a chance to study at school. So I saw why it mattered. But I think in terms of the big picture now, there's a sort of paradox here that I think we all on one level recognize that continuing education is in many ways of growing importance, that because we have, you know, very rapid technological change, you know, people need to adapt their skills, their knowledge levels, learn more, learn how to learn in an intensifying way. But at the same time, there is diminished participation. I mean, despite your success stories, we're getting fewer people doing part-time study in universities and in adult education. It's a declining sector, sadly. So why is this? I mean, I think there are problems on the demand side and with supply. I think on the demand side, what's happened is that the generation of people who wanted a second chance, my parents' situation, I think that has largely passed. I mean, most people now who want and qualify for universities have the chance to do it. So that whole second chance generation has largely gone. And there's also this problem that those people who have the funding to go enroll for courses often don't have the time, and the people who do have the time often don't have the money. So there is sort of a bind in both directions. But there are also, supply problems that, the cost has gone up. When I was in government, we thought we had made real progress by opening up, say, the Open University and similar institutions to the loan scheme, and we were pressed by the colleges to do that. But we then found that people were much more intimidated by the fees than the lack of access to a loan. So loss of subsidy has been a key point, and I think and a lot of people are discovering other ways to learn. I mean, you can get highly intelligent, insightful programs on BBC4. You can do all kind of self-learning through the Khan Academy or MOOCs that are now becoming common in the higher education sector. So going to the old-fashioned type of adult education colleges no longer seems the obvious way forward. But however, having said all that, I think more can be done. And particularly to overcome the financial barriers. And that's why we proposed this idea of lifelong learning accounts, of people being given at certain parts of their lives a sum of money. It could be, we suggested 9,000, but it could be different. When they leave college, when they're 35, when they're 50. And then they can draw on these accounts to finance a course in adult education or a course such as those you offer. And I would hope that the government buys into this. It would appear from the Queen's speech that there is something happening. What the scheme amounts to, I don't know, but at least they've bitten on the concept. I think it needs to be demonstrated that it will work. There was something similar tried with Gordon Brown's era, you may remember, the individual learning accounts, and it collapsed because of fraud. A lot of providers were offering bogus courses, and the process of screening would have to be much more severe. And we don't yet know how far loans and fees and grants, how far this is the key barrier. But to the extent to which money is an issue, learning accounts would take us forward, I think.
Yes, it seems one problem is that that all governments, I don't know if the government you're in is guilty of this as well, but all governments seem completely obsessed with just skills and jobs and skills. And so certainly one thing, what I learned on our commission was rereading that 1919 report. It was amazingly sort of far-sighted, and sort of, almost revolutionary, broad-minded in terms of not just being so blinkered. I mean, they actually did really press the idea about skills and new technologies coming along, but they made the point actually, therefore, because there's unknown technologies coming along, it's no good just training in today's skills. You need people with capabilities and capacity. But they also made the more general points that education is good for society and for democracy and for the individuals. And people, governments seem scared off by that, because this the current government actually had some very good stuff in their manifesto, and as you say, they did put something in the Queen's speech, but again, it seems have collapsed back into just being very narrow, just on skills and jobs, and not the philosophy that you point out your mother studied.
Yeah, there's a real problem, I think, in government with people's view about what education is all about. I had terrible problems negotiating with the Treasury about money because of some of the inbuilt biases they had, and there were really two. One was that the only thing that really matters is to become a graduate. Most civil servants, senior civil servants, and most politicians these days are graduates. They want their children to go to university and become undergraduates. they have absolutely no understanding of the needs of the 50% of the population who don't or don't want to, or for various reasons are not able to. The whole FE concept is just not grasped in central government. And to the extent to which people do think about the 50% of people who don't go to university, it's entirely in terms of very specific vocational skills, learning how to work a lathe or whatever. The idea that education is valuable in itself, it's very difficult to get across. And there was a particular bias against adult education. There was this sort of idea that somehow this is middle-class women basket weaving, and that was the sort of concept of what people thought adult education was about, and it was patronizing and ignorant, actually. I fought hard to protect some adult education budgets, but people in the system just didn't understand why. They thought this was at a time when I was having to make difficult decisions elsewhere. Why on earth was I trying to protect this little corner of government spending, which was such a waste? That's how they saw it.
Yes, the deputy chair of the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, Sir Alan Tuckett, always made the point that the real skill actually is the ability to learn.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't matter whether you're studying philosophy or anything else, you learn that ability to learn.
Exactly. That's the core argument.
Now, I want to throw it open for other people to ask questions, so I'll skip on to another subject, and no doubt others can pick up lifelong learning if they want to, but I wanted to ask about another area where I know, Kellogg College and you have another common interest, which is mutuality, employee ownership. We've got a centre on mutuality and co-ownership, and I heard you many years ago giving a fantastic talk at the Employee Ownership Association annual meeting. And I remember you saying that the demutualization of the building societies was one of the greatest acts of economic vandalism in modern times. But again, it's a bit of a puzzle to me, given that mutuals, employee-owned organizations, throughout history in different countries have shown to be very successful and give positive benefits, not just the economy, but the communities they're in, the individuals who work with them and so on. Again, there's very, very little effort by UK governments to try and increase corporate diversity, even though there's sometimes, pledges to do so. So I suppose the question is, what do you think the benefits are of different corporate forms, and B, why, what do we need to do to get the message across to government?
I think there are people in government who understand in a broad level the advantages of having diverse ownership systems. But there are genuine practical problems I discovered. I tried to promote it. If you think about the mutual sector, particularly in banking and insurance, a lot of which, of course, disappeared because of demutualization and carpetbagging. Government did actually intervene to stop it, if you remember, I think 2001. And which is why Nationwide and a few others survived. Employee-owned companies, the John Lewis concept is something all governments pay lip service to, and they've improved the tax incentives, but there aren't a great many of such companies. And the fact that we always cite John Lewis suggests that the limited breadth of the sector. There is much more happening in social enterprise, widely defined. In other words, that have a charitable board overseeing what is essentially a commercial enterprise. I happen to be on the board of a big social enterprise in the transport sector, and they are flourishing more than the other bits of the kind of unconventional sectors. But why is it they don't grow? Well, I think one important practical reason, it's actually very difficult to raise capital. If you don't have any equity, you either produce an organization that is dangerously geared, or you just have to grow very slowly through retained profits. And so this sort of inhibits the expansion of mutuals and social enterprises. I think a second reason is that ownership, particularly if it's vested in members or consumers, is very fragmented. And so you don't have proper control over management in the way that you do with sort of large institutional shareholders. And this does result in sometimes in very bad governance. I mean, the Co-op Bank was, of course, the classic example. The Dunfermline Building Society was as bad as any of the big banks in the way it performed. So there are genuine problems with trying to expand this sector because of its ownership structure. But I'm sure, you know, with real dedication, we could do an awful lot more. I mean, the German banking system is much more engaged with local communities because of the way that it operates at the lowest tier. And, you know, there are many examples across Europe of good cooperatives, good mutuals. And Britain is relatively underdeveloped.
Yeah. Well, that segues nicely into the next thing I wanted to ask you about was your time in government, because the coalition government, of which you're a member, 2010, 2015, actually in the coalition agreement did pledge to increase the corporate diversity of the financial services sector as one way of trying to head off a further repeat of the global financial crisis. And it seemed to, I see our research fellow Ruth Yeomans joined us, and we, in our Centre for Mutual and Co-owned Business, we made the case for implementing that by returning Northern Rock, you know, to being a mutual. But of course, instead it was sold to Richard Branson and some New York hedge funds. So I wondered about your time in government and what you thought, well, what you were pleased about having achieved, and what you're sort of frustrated at not being able to do more of.
Well, just before I get on to the bigger picture, just quickly respond to your last point. I mean, actually, one of the things I tried to do when I left Parliament, actually in 2015 for a couple of years, was to help set up one of these community banks along German lines. But the reason why it was incredibly difficult to do it was that the financial regulators considered it to be high risk, and we just couldn't get regulatory approval, and we're spending, you know, tens of thousands on endless consultancy reports to prove our value to the regulators. And for a small organization trying to serve a local community, you quickly found that your overheads were making the whole project worthless. So, you know, people have tried in different ways. In terms of role in government, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I mean, there were other Lib Dem ministers who achieved a great deal. I mean, things like the pupil premium, the indexation of the state pension, Steve Webb did, and things of that kind. The work was done on lifting low earners out of income tax. But certainly in terms of my department, I introduced the industrial strategy. It was sort of partly building on what Peter Mandelson had done, but we did a lot for core industries, cars, aerospace, life sciences, and, you know, got whole sectors of the economy thinking in a much more long-term way and investing. Set up the Green Investment Bank and the British Business Bank, set up the Catapult Network, which has proved extremely important in improving British innovation, and stopped a whole lot of very bad things happening. I mean, my Tory colleagues wanted to sweep away all trade union rights, the right to strike, wanted to, well, not Tories particularly, but you know, had we not stopped it, the decimation of further education, adult education. So there are a lot of what I would regard as achievements, but there were, you know, negatives. I mean, I fought all kinds of battles when I was in government and lost quite a few of them. I think probably the most important was a kind of long-term battle with the Treasury over public investment, because actually what we'd agreed in the coalition agreement that we would try to balance the current budget, which, because, you know, the deficit was out of control in 2010 because of the banking crisis, we didn't say anything about public investment, but the Treasury sort of moved the goalpost and stopped vast amounts of public investment in infrastructure and things. And I think I was to some extent the lone voice in government saying this was economically very damaging, and it was the worst aspect of austerity because of the impact it had on the construction industry and so on. So I lost that battle. And what I had hoped to do when I first got into government, and this all happened in 24 hours, was I wanted to have control of the banking sector. And I was happy to give away responsibility for universities, which would have saved us all the problems around tuition fees. But the decision was taken. They weren't going to change the structure of government departments to suit me. And so I had to put up with the structure I inherited, with all the difficulties that followed.
Okay, I see there's lots of questions coming to the chat room, so I'll just limit myself to one more question before handing over, which is introducing Sir Vince. I should have said he has written many books, and his latest one, Money and Power, I highly recommend. I've just read it. It's absolutely fascinating. It's looking at various political leaders and what they did economically in their countries, from starting with Alexander Hamilton, as in the musical, right down to Donald Trump, as in You've Been Fired, their American version of that show, with Lenin, Thatcher, and other leaders in between. So I mean, I could spend all evening asking about this event, but in researching the book, were there any particular surprises, or anyone particularly impressed you that you hadn't expected to be?
Well, I think the main conclusion was that what I was looking at were some of the big political figures in history and what they did that changed the way that we approach economic policy. Because, of course, economic policy isn't made by economists, it's made by politicians. They may work through central banks, but ultimately politicians make the key economic call. So the question I was looking at was, where do they get their ideas from, and why did they do what they did? And what struck me, there was the more figures I looked at and the big economic policy changes in modern history, was that how so much of it happened by accident, not by design. Peel, for example, Robert Peel, who launched Britain on the route to free trade, was the last 200 years, was a protectionist, and he changed tack under pressure from Corn Law protesters and the urban working class becoming increasingly restless. But he didn't believe in it. I mean, it was tried to oppose opening up British markets for grain as long as possible. Bismarck probably did more than anybody to change the economic landscape of the last 19th century. He launched the first common market, the Zollverein. He protected the German industrial complex, why Germany became such a powerful manufacturing company. And he was the first statesman to launch a welfare state, long ahead of Britain and other countries. But it was all done very reluctantly and to some extent by accident. He didn't believe in any of those things. And probably the more topical example, of course, is Roosevelt. And everybody now talks about the New Deal and the wonders of Keynesian economics. But the interesting thing about Roosevelt, of course, he did an enormous amount of stuff. He's a great reformer, but he didn't believe in Keynesian economics. He was trenchantly opposed to it, believed in balanced budgets and was denouncing the Republicans for spending too much public money. And he didn't believe in what he's subsequently been credited with having done. And that, I could go on, but there were, of course, a few people, Ludwig Erhard in post-war Germany, Margaret Thatcher, Erlander, who was the main kind of social democratic reformer in Sweden, who did have a mission, who did believe in things, and they used office to drive through a policy revolution. But they weren't, that wasn't the normal, that's not the main way things happen. Just a sort of final thought, I mean, whether anybody I felt were particularly sort of heroic or developed a great admiration for, well, actually, probably the most important figure, I think, in modern history since the Second World War is Deng Xiaoping in China. People are now getting quite excited about China in a negative way, but for 200 years, China was on its back pretty much, and Mao didn't improve things. But then Deng took power, and he established a system since the late 1970s, which has transformed China into economic superpower. And largely it was his insights and his policy change which made all that possible. And this was a revolutionary, a very ruthless man. He killed a lot of people and did some very unpleasant things, culminating in the Tiananmen Square massacre. But as a reformer, he lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And nobody matches that, with the possible exception to a modest degree of Manmohan Singh in India. But Deng Xiaoping stands out in the whole post-war world, in my view.
Yes, and actually, I didn't know until reading your book that that Deng had learnt that from going to Russia, the Soviet Union, in the 1920s, and witnessing Lenin abandoning war communism and introducing the new economic policy.
Yes.
Which I think it sort of ruminated on for decades following that, and then put it into practice in China.
Indeed.
Yeah, good. Well, that segues nice into Mark's question. Now, this is being recorded, so Mark, if you don't want to be filmed, then just switch your microphone on. But if you don't mind being filmed, it'd be useful if you put your microphone on so people can see you asking your question. Mark, do you want to ask your question? If not, well, I'll just read it out, which is probably going to be my next question anyway. So Vince, about you've written a number of books, this being the most recent, and have you got any plans for any more?
Well, I've got a book coming out in September, which is the China Conundrum. So I've spent the last year working on China. I don't know a great deal about it. I didn't before I started, but I got involved in looking at China when I was at Shell. I did some scenario planning around China, and I was heavily involved in our relationship with the Chinese government. When I was in government, I was responsible for trade, amongst other things. So I've been spending the last year writing this book, and it will be rather controversial because the current fashion is that we mustn't do anything with China. They're just so awful. I think that's completely wrong. I think we don't really understand where they're coming from. The government is nasty and Xi is dictatorial, but the Chinese have a perfectly reasonable case that they need to be taken seriously and treated with respect as a great power, and that it's very much in our interest to engage with them, not to engage in some kind of new Cold War. So that's what's on the way.
Great. Okay. Well, we can talk about that more when you visit in a year's time. But meanwhile, Mark had a rider about did you enjoy your time on Strictly? And I should say, in case you're there's any danger of you being overly modest, Sir Vince, that I'm told by my wife Carolyn, who's an addict, that you performed extremely well and scored 36 out of 40 from the judges.
Yes, I should, for this, I'm not being falsely modest, but I would stress that this was on the Christmas show. It wasn't on the full series. I don't know how long I would have survived if I'd been on the full series, but I was a cabinet minister at the time. There's limits to the extent to which you can go out dancing, but I had 10 lessons, I think, with the wonderful Erin. And I felt, even when I was in the cabinet, I used to have regular dancing lessons. It was one of the things that kept me sane. So I think that was it was a legitimate time out, and it occurred at the time when all that awful business with Rupert Murdoch and so on was occurring. So it took my mind off some of the more unpalatable aspects of public life.
Great. Okay, well, Tony Harris, I think you want to cheer us all up with a question about Brexit, do you?
Yes, that's right. Hi, Vince.
Hello.
Hello there.
Very impressive room you're in there.
This is all the books that I had to read doing my PhD, which I just finished in January, actually, as a mature student. So, yeah. Anyway, yes. So, welcome. So, City of London's just suffered a 2.3 trillion loss in derivatives tradings, I think, which went either to the United States or to Europe. Now, obviously, the amount of sort of money that the city would have lost is far less than that in terms of commissions. It's trading volume that they've lost. Do you think that this is just the tip of the iceberg, or it's a flash in the pan? I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Well, when the Brexit debate was going on, I think some of us tried to calculate what the effects of a hard Brexit, which is what we've got, would have on the City of London. I think the arithmetic we eventually come up with was that 20% of city business was conducted in European terms, competing with Europe, and probably half of that would be lost. So we're talking 10, 12% of city business. And that's a lot of jobs, and it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of tax revenue. The more bullish view, which you will hear from the banking community and others, is that they're pretty resilient people, and it's been a nasty shock, but they will adapt to it. But I think in many ways the city story is part of a bigger picture that, you know, Brexit will impose a cost on the British economy. It's not spectacular. It's not a overnight collapse or anything of that kind, but it's taking a chunk out of British economic growth, and it will be experienced in the form of people having somewhat lower living standards than they otherwise would have, but it will be quite difficult to measure. And it will take place slowly over a long period of time, which is why I think probably in 15 years, maybe, we will go back to this question, not necessarily rejoining. We don't know what Europe will be like then, but trying to recreate some of the structures in the way that countries like Norway have, in which we retain the fundamentals of the single market and the customs union, which is what we've lost.
And Tony, you've got a second question, so while you've got the mic, why don't you carry on?
Yeah, it was about the the British Business Bank, which of course you were instrumental in the creation of it. It's been very successful in its investments in the south of England and in Oxford, Cambridge and London in particular, but the north is still lacking capital investment, particularly in the startup area. I mean, there are a small number of angel groups and VCs, but they really have southern focus rather than northern focus. Do you think that the British Business Bank has to change its focus and start focusing on the northern side of things instead of the south?
Well, when it was set up, I insisted that they establish the base in Sheffield so that it had a northern focused perspective. But, you know, inevitably they respond to market forces. They're supposed to be run on a commercial basis. In some ways, the problem that we were trying to address when I got this launched back in 2012-13 was a different one. It was about how do you get the banking system lending again? Because in the wake of the financial crisis, credit had dried up, and so you couldn't, you know, builders couldn't get loans to build. Startups couldn't get any kind of money. Ordinary businesses, you know, couldn't get supply chain finance or whatever. There was a famine of credit, and the British Business Bank was there to help get credit flowing. And one of the first things they did was to put money into the new fintech, peer-to-peer lending organizations like Funding Circle and Zopa, and that was, you know, a genuinely useful contribution in that context. But we're now dealing with a different problem, which is, you know, regional imbalances in commercial funding, and that's got to be dealt with in a different way. And I think what the British Business Bank should be trying to do is to support some of these enterprising regional institutions like the Atom Bank, which is trying to fund do peer-to-peer transactions in the northeast of England, and things of that kind. There is a particular problem, which you know better than me because it's your business, but this whole problem of getting patient finance into, you know, rapidly growing companies that fall between. They're not SMEs, but equally they're not big corporates, and they can't use the bond market. So where do they get their money from? And there's a bit of institutional progress. There was another organization which I helped to set up in government called the Business Growth Fund, which does that kind of work. It provides, you know, 20-year funding for rapid growth, medium-sized companies, and it helps to fill the so-called valley of death. But they're doing that loan by loan. I mean, it's not doing it on a mega scale. And I would think that something like the Business Growth Fund needs probably a bit of supplementary finance. The thing we did in the coalition, which has now been completely forgotten, which I think was Nick Clegg, actually, who got some money from the Treasury to establish something called the Regional Growth Fund. And that provided equity capital, I mean, in grant form, actually, to projects mainly in the north of England, the West Midlands, and the so-called left behind areas. And Michael Heseltine was chairman of a group of entrepreneurs who evaluated these projects, and we got money into them on quite a big scale, and they're all kind of, really good projects around the country which got launched. But then funding ran out in 2014, and this lot didn't do anything to revive it. But to meet the problem you described, I think that probably is what we should be working on.
Great, thanks very much. Now, Ruth Yeoman, I see you've got a question. And to fire away.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating stuff, and particularly interesting to learn that much of what goes on in economic policy appears to be completely accidental. But given that perhaps industrial policy formation isn't entirely futile, I wonder what you might say about the kinds of economic and social capabilities and institutions that are missing in the United Kingdom that we need to develop post-pandemic. And here, of course, I guess we're particularly interested in any kinds of capabilities that might link mutual ownership and lifelong learning, but I wouldn't want to confine you to that.
Well, first of all, just to just what I'd said earlier on, I wasn't trying to imply that all economic policies are sort of random. It isn't, but what I was talking there was about some of the big paradigm shifts that have happened in history, which is, I think, a bit different. But in terms of what's missing in having a coherent industrial policy in the UK, I think some things are better. First of all, support for innovation was a big problem. We just didn't have the support for innovative companies that you get in, say, Germany. And that was why the Catapult network was set up, and it's working well, and it probably needs additional funding, but we've got a good model now in the UK. Supply of finance is still an issue, and I think the things I've just said about the regional biases in funding and certain types of companies, there are gaps then that need filling, but we're in a better position. I think the area where we've gone backwards, and which I think is a policy failure, is what's happened with training. I don't mean adult education now, I mean training. We'd actually made a lot of progress in building up apprenticeships. Was something I very much focused on with the support of some of the Conservative ministers I was working with. And we got a massive increase in volume and in quality. And we're beginning to break through this kind of snobbery around vocational post-school education. But then the last government introduced the apprenticeship levy, which has been an utter disaster. So instead of incentivizing companies to do training they otherwise wouldn't do, it's effectively imposed a tax on training, which is absolutely absurd. And the revenue that was supposed to be used to fund new apprenticeships has sat in accounts in the Treasury, and the Treasury has just snaffled it. It's been an absolute disaster, and I think most companies that invest in training are just in despair about the way the funding of apprenticeships now works. So that's the area I would really want to focus on. And then finally, of course, the government has actually formally abandoned industrial strategy. I don't know why. The President, Secretary of State, Kwasi Kwarteng, says that he's bee in his bonnet about it. I think it's ideology as much as anything else. But, we had continuity before. Heseltine established the foundations. Peter Mandelson did good work under the Labour government. I took this on. It was carried on subsequently by Clark, my successor. And then suddenly, out of the blue, we don't want industrial strategy anymore. I mean, it's a kind of very kind of silly, rather sort of egotistical way of decision making, and it completely breaks this sort of cross-party continuity and consensus that you need to do stuff in government.
Okay, Ruth. If anyone else got a question, you can either put it in the chat room or raise your hand. On the bottom of your screen, you should have a reactions option where one option is to raise your hand. So Isabel Murphy, do you want to switch your camera on to ask your question? Your camera and microphone. Oh, sorry, you say unable to use video at the moment. Yeah, could you just switch your microphone on then and ask your question?
Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Sir Vince, for taking time out to speak to us tonight. But I'm partway through a DPhil thesis at the moment, and I also work. I've worked part-time as an accounts manager for a local business. And I'd just be interested to hear how you schedule your writing into the rest of your life, because that's one of the challenges I'm facing at the moment. And I'd be interested to know how many words you aim to write a day, or on the days that you do your writing.
Well, I recognise your problem. I mean, I had it when I was younger. I tried to do my PhD when I was teaching economics to undergraduates. I was also a Glasgow City Councillor in my spare time, and I was helping my wife bring up babies. So it wasn't straightforward, and I wasn't very efficient, and far too long to write my PhD. So it's something you had to learn. I suppose what I have learned over the years is I have learned to write very fast, and not necessarily always well, but I've learned to write fast, and that was I write fastest and some extent best writing in pen and ink. I mean, I now have to use a computer, which is actually slows you down. I think it's much more difficult to think and type at the same time. But I think the one skill you do have, well, there are two skills you have to learn. One is compartmentalizing your mind, and that's difficult, but you just have to work on it and put other things aside and just concentrate on what you're doing. And the other is to learn to write fast. And as I say, I find this easier with biro and paper. But it requires a lot of practice. I mean, it's not something that just comes overnight.
Thank you. That's interesting. I've been involved in lifelong learning, in further education since 2011, when I started a master's. And I have to say that both the master's and the DPhil are completely paperless, which I find I'm quite proud of, in view of the fact I'm in my 7th decade. But I find that interesting that you write on. I haven't tried writing.
Yes,
on,
well, I've been very indulgent in the past because I had people to do my typing for me, and I've had to learn to be my own typist. And it's the way we now communicate. So we've all got to learn to do it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, George Leeson. I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to switch your camera on? Yep.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd add my thanks to everyone else's thanks to Sir Vince for finding the time to share his experiences and thoughts with us. And I know the what if questions are always the ones you don't want to get. But given your interest in the history of politics and your own working time in politics, what if the Lib Dems had chosen Gordon Brown rather than David Cameron? Do you think we'd be in a place today?
Well, I wanted it to in fact, at the time, we're talking May 2010, I spent a lot of time talking to Gordon Brown. I knew him quite well. We have a good relationship, and I was the kind of Lib Dem link to him. and we tried very hard to put an alternative together. The problem was several. One was that the arithmetic wasn't there. I mean, the only way you could have constructed a government with the Lib Dems and Gordon Brown was if we'd also had not just the Green lady and the SDLP in Northern Ireland, we'd have had to bring in the SNP from Scotland, which would have been highly problematic, and the DUP from Northern Ireland, even more problematic. So it wouldn't have been a very stable arrangement. A second problem was that although Gordon and some of his people were keen to work with us, some of the up-and-coming Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, David Miliband, they didn't want to. I mean, they knew that it was going to be a terrible few years, clearing up the mess after the financial crisis, and they were happy to step back and let somebody else do it. So there wasn't the will on the Labour side. Gordon personally was very keen on doing this. So that's why it didn't happen. And quite over and above that, there was at the time a kind of raging financial crisis. We genuinely worried, rightly or wrongly, that we were potentially the new Greece. We had to have a stable government, and the only way of doing it is with the Conservatives. I mean, it didn't always work out well, as I'm sure you're going to tell me, but that was actually the only practical option we had.
Great. Thanks. That sort of segues into a question I wanted to ask, which was about, what happened to the coalition government and the 2015 election, because so Vince, in answer to several of the questions, you've given some very good examples of good things you did manage to get done, some of which were then blocked by the Conservative coalition partners. And yet, so it must have been particularly frustrating for you in the 2015 election. The Lib Dems seem to have got punished in that election, yes, and the Conservatives seem to take all the glory for anything good done and blamed you for anything.
Well, it's a sort of narrative is built up around the 2015 election, which everybody now subscribes to, which I think unfortunately is wrong. I mean, the popular view is that, the Lib Dems, as you say, we were blamed for all the bad things. And the people who voted for us in 2010 stopped doing so out of disgust and disillusionment. But actually, that wasn't the reason. The number of people who who switched to Labour or the Greens in 2015 was not enough to do the damage that was done. We'd have got down from 56 to 30, 35 MPs, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the Tories had this absolutely ruthlessly effective campaign, which had this very simple slogan that if you don't vote for the Conservatives, you're going to get Mr. Miliband and the SNP and the horrors of the SNP. And certainly in the area I was, people were scared. And so they didn't switch from me to the Labour Party, they switched to the Tories. There's a fear factor and it worked for them. So it was, the story is a very different one from, I think, what's generally believed.
No, interesting. And could I ask you about your time then as leader of the Lib Dem Party? Because and you did actually very well in the elections when you were leader in the European elections, and then you decided to hand over the leadership, and Joe Swinson became leader and didn't do so well in the next election. So I wonder whether you slightly regret having stepped down so soon, whether you shouldn't have stayed on. And then again, I have no idea what the truth of any of this is, but the media report seems to be that Joe Swinson was maybe a bit sort of inexperienced and not such a good street fighter in politics, and sort of fell for Boris Johnson's manoeuvring to get the general election run, when he wanted it on his terms, get Brexit done, and she sort of fell for that and was, doomed as a result, and that then he didn't necessarily run the best campaign. And some media reports said that you were a bit skeptical about whether that was the right approach.
Well, first of all, I think it's possible to give too much credit and too much blame to political leaders. I mean, it happened that we did do very well at the end of my period, mainly in local government, actually, but also in the European election. But, you know, a bit of that was luck as well as what I've been doing. But yeah, it was a mixture of good luck and good management. And in terms of what happened since, the same applies. There were bad calls, but also bad luck. I mean, there was quite a strong argument within my parliamentary colleagues as to whether we should go for that early election. I was very strongly opposed to it. Quite a few of my colleagues were. But Joe, not just Joe, but quite a lot of the people advising her thought that it was the right thing to do. And it turned out not to have been. But, you know, it's easy to say in hindsight that some people were right and some people were wrong. But it had, unfortunately, disastrous consequences. The counter argument, which we were advancing at the time, some of us, was that if we'd stuck at it, the withdrawal bill would have attracted amendments like a customs union, which the hardline Brexiteers would have hated, and they would have rebelled. And Boris Johnson would have found himself in the same problem that Theresa May had, and the Tories would have got into desperate trouble. But we couldn't guarantee that was going to happen. And, you know, I'm not sort of blaming Joe. I mean, it's so easy with hindsight to say people got it wrong, but there were a lot of people who agreed with it at the time.
Yeah. Thanks. David Griffiths, do you want to put your camera on and ask your question?
Yes, hopefully I'm visible.
You can hear you.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So Vince, you have, I think, commented recently on the issue of Scottish independence, and you are someone who has lived in Scotland and represented people there. So what do you think is going to happen in this aspect of our national life?
I think it's not a good outcome, actually. You know, you can tell all kind of scenarios about it, but I think what the government, the UK government, now seems determined to do is that when the Scottish Parliament requests a referendum, which they'll do in about 12 to 18 months, the British government will say no, no, we don't have to, and we're not going to agree. And the effect of that will be to alienate people in Scotland even more, because the union will no longer be based on consent, and that will build up resentment. And at some point, you know, the dam will burst. Either they will act unilaterally, or it will all be stored up until the next government. And when the referendum does come, they will vote for independence. My advice to Mr. Johnson, which I'm sure he's not even listening to, let alone accepting, would be that he should go for a referendum soon, in a year, 18 months' time, and say, okay, you know, we're willing to take you on. There is a powerful argument for remaining in the union, that you know, otherwise we're going to have borders at Hadrian's Wall. You're going to have this horrendous problem with your fiscal deficit. It's about 8% of GDP. You'll have to push up taxes and cut spending. And what kind of money are you going to use? And a lot of Scots are, you know, very aware that, you know, beneath the emotional nationalistic appeal, there are some hard economic questions which are not being answered by the nationalists. And I think if we took them on with an early referendum, I think the union would be confirmed. It's a gamble, but I think it would be. And if that happened, then the SNP would become totally irrelevant. It would drift away like the Parti Québécois in Canada, and we would return to, you know, Scotland playing a part in UK politics, albeit in a devolved system. But that's a gamble, and I think they're probably going to make the wrong guess and try and play long. And I think the effects on alienating people in Scotland will be cumulatively negative.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you have a question?
I was just wondering if we had, I'm just keeping an eye on the time here as the timekeeper for our session, and I just wondered if we had time for one more question for Sir Vince.
Yes, if you, yeah, but have you got one?
No, no.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, well, we do, and if no one else is putting their hands up or messaging, then I'll ask one, which is about your books, events, and your next edition of it, and whether you think you'll be able to include a chapter on Boris Johnson, and if so, what will it say? Do you think he?
No, he hasn't transformed, the way we think about economic policy. He doesn't begin to qualify. I think that the issue I would want to consider is whether Trump should be there. And I think actually he should, for bad reasons. I mean, he has been transformational. He's transformed the way we think about economic policy, because his America First policy on trade has effectively torn up 70 years of understanding about America's belief in an open trading system and a rules-based order and economic terms. And although Biden is doing a lot of remarkable and wonderful things, he's completely bought into the Trump Trump agenda on trade and the international economic system. And Trump has made that happen. As I say, it's a negative achievement that he has changed the world, and in that sense, I think he merits a chapter.
Mm. And some might argue he also changed the nature of politics in terms of just being allowed to say whatever you want, whether it's true or not, and somehow it doesn't matter.
Contribution from a kind of liberal democracy point of view is unbelievably awful, but it's massive and will be very difficult to reverse.
Yeah, I can see our friend Carlotta from California rolling her eyes. Good. Okay, well, Sir Vince, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We really look forward this time next year when you're able to come to into college. For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask your questions this evening, do hold them, keep thinking about them for this time next year, where you can ask them at the event and indeed over dinner with Sir Vince afterwards. So in the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Vince. It was fantastic having you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.